Welcome to today's lesson, CSS Cascading Style Sheets. And I wanted us to look, and this is not the actual chapter where we're going to be discussing CSS into detail, but I wanted us to have a brief understanding of what CSS is, the basics, because we want to use it in some HTML topics going forward. So this is just a little bit of information. We're going to have a detailed CSS chapter where we're going to talk about more detailed stuff. So this is just going to be a brief introduction to CSS. Well, as we discussed in the introductory chapter of this class, we use CSS to format a web page, kind of give it some cool designs, font, color, size, background, all that customizing, right, to make your web page look nicer, neater, cleaner, and more readable, more understandable, and just adding style to your page. What cascading means is in the word CSS means is uh, when a style is applied to a parent element, which we're going to discuss, it trickles down to all the children elements, right? So it cascades to all the sub elements under the parent element. So CSS can be added to your web page in three ways, and we have talked about one of the ways in all the previous uh, lessons that we've had, and that is the inline methodology or the inline way of adding CSS. And this is by using the style attributes that we have been discussing, right? So whenever you use the style attribute inside an HTML element, you that's the inline way of adding CSS. We also have the internal way of adding CSS, and that is by using the style element again in the head section of your HTML page. And we are going to take a look at that also. And we're also going to be reviewing the external way of adding, which is by far the most popular. And I don't know anybody who doesn't use this methodology, but this is the most popular methodology of adding your CSS to your web page. Mainly because you can specify, you can target multiple pages using the same file, right? So what happens in this is that is you use a link element that points to an external CSS file. That means that a file that is saved as a .css and has some styles in it. So let's delve right in and see what we have. So let's talk about the first one, and I'm gonna put a comment in here. And you wonder how I got this comment. First is control and backslash, right? And that would generate this comment thing. So we are going to talk about the inline CSS, and I'm going to give an example. I'm going to put a h1 element, and I'm going to say this is uh, uh, an inline CSS example, right? And now for inline, we style the elements, right? And inline is used uniquely to style a single HTML element, right? So just for this H1 element, I'm going to use it for this H1 element, right? And obviously, we know that the style attribute is what we use. So we have a style attribute and then the equal to sign and then your quotation, and in here we are going to put our style. So I'm going to say let's color this heading uh and it goes with color colon and then whatever value, right? And the value, let's say green, right? So I color this font green. So when I refresh this, you have this is an inline CSS example all in green. So this is an example of your inline. I'm going to give another example. Let's say P, let's P element, and say this is a cool paragraph. I always have a problem spelling paragraph, but it's all good. And then I'm going to style this. Again, the style is for a single element, and so you put the style uh, attribute equal to, and then let's color this. What do you want to color this? Brown. Okay. And so when I refresh this again, you have this is a cool paragraph. So this is a simple example of inline CSS, which we've talked about in the past lessons. For internal, let's look at the internal CSS again. I'm gonna comment out this code, control backslash, and put in the internal CSS. And the internal CSS is basically used or defined for the entire page, right? So again, the inline CSS is for just the elements, right? So for example, H1 element, the style affects only that, right? But for internal CSS, the styles that you put in the head affects the entire document, right? So that's the one difference. And in the internal CSS is defined in the head section, so be very wary of that. It's always defined in the head section of your HTML page within a style element. So we'll look at that also. So let's take an example, and I'm just gonna comment this out because we don't need this. So let's have a whole page design. So we have a doc type, which is going to be HTML, signifying HTML5. And then we're going to have our HTML. In here, we're going to have our head. And then we're going to have our body right below this. Good. And then let's have some elements in our body that we want to display. So I'm going to put an H1 and say this is an internal CSS example. And then I'm going to put a paragraph P and say this is a really long paragraph. Okay, cool. So now we have this, right? So we are not going to style these individually in the body or in the element itself. We are going to style them differently, and I'm going to refresh this so you see how it looks like. So there's no style whatsoever within these two elements. So now we are going to add the internal CSS style. So in the head, we're going to have a style, good, a style attribute. Let me clean the space. And in the style attribute, we are going to now put our CSS. And the format for this is simple. We are going to have the element that we are targeting, right? So the first one, let's target the body of the, so the whole body. So everything under the head section or under this, the body of this. So the whole page itself. So let's target the body. So you put in the element you're targeting and then opening and closing parenthesis. And in here, you're going to now target what style you want to give it. So I want to change the background color. So I go background color and then I want to give it a tomato. I love, I love this. Right? And then, so that's it. You put the element you're targeting, which is the body in this case, and then what feature of this you want to target, so the background color. So if I refresh this, you have this tomato-like color in the background. So that's how we do it. So now let's target the H1 and then the P element. So I'm gonna say H1 and then do this and then put in the maybe font color. So I'm gonna target just the color and say I want it to be green, right? So you have it as green. You can put this in there. And so if I refresh this, I have it as green. Next thing, I'm gonna target the P, and then I'm gonna put in there, let's say the color also, and then let's say white. Doesn't matter, but white should do it. So if I refresh this, this is a really long paragraph. So this is inline formatting. And like I said, so anytime I have a P tag, so let's say I have another P down here. This is a second P, right? And I refresh this, you're gonna see that's gonna take the color of the P because it said you want all P's to take this color. So you see that we don't have to style them individually, right? One style is good for every element in the page, right? So I kind of had HTML, but it's HTML. Okay, so this is inline CSS. So I'm gonna talk about the third type, which is gonna be uh the external uh, CSS. So I'll comment this out, drag this, and then I'm gonna have a comment here saying external CSS, which is by far the most popular way of adding your CSS. So let me refresh this so you see there's nothing on the page. So let's have a HTML again. So we have our doc type. I really wish I could just copy this so we don't. Yeah, let's do that. I'm gonna just copy this, paste it right here. I'll comment this out. Yep. And then we don't need the style in here, so I'm gonna delete this. And then we are having whatever in our body still. Okay. So with the external CSS, the style sheet is defined in an external file. So you have an external file somewhere in your directory, and you're going to save it as a .css, and then you're going to reference that file, which is going to have your styles, right? So we're going to reference it in your head section. So in my head, I'm going to have a link. So I'm going to have this link, and then in the link, I'm going to have rel defining what it is I am referencing. So this in this case is going to be a style sheet. So this you need to put in the style sheet, right? And then the next one is your href, which is going to tell you where your file is. So we don't have the file yet, but I'm going to put it in the same folder. So I'm just going to, and I'm going to name it styles.css. We don't have it yet, but we're going to create it, right? And then I'm going to have this. So if I refresh this, you only see the basic, right? Because it doesn't, we don't have the styles file yet, so it doesn't have any style to load, right? So right now we are going to create that file. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it styles.css, same name as we stated here. And in the styles.css, I'm going to put in there some styles, right? So it's the same format, the element you're targeting, right? Opening and closing. And then you put in there what you are targeting. So the background color and coral. I don't need tomatoes no more. I'm going to put in there a coral color. So yeah, this looks good. And then what else should we target? Let's target the H1, which we already have. And you don't need, it could be on the same line. So you can do color. And then let's say green. Right, so you can put it on the same line. And let's say P. Let's target the P. Oh, You can put it on different, right? And say color and say white. Okay. So now we have our CSS and it's full of the styles we want to target, the background of the body, the H1, and then your piece, right? So if I refresh this, voila, we have the styles reflecting just as we want it. So let's look at some basic CSS, right? Let's look at some colors, fonts, and sizes, right? So let's add some color. We already had the color, right? Let's add another uh what is it? Let's make this, and so we can add multiple lines. Let's say we want to change the font family, and the font family property defines the font to be used. So we're gonna change the font family and say we want to use uh Verdana, right? So let's use Verdana, whatever, right? Let's just say Verdana, and when we refresh this, we have Verdana font. We can also change the font size, which is the size of your font, right? And then let's say 300%. And then if you refresh this, you see 300%, right? And then what else do we want to look at? The border, CSS borders. So a border is defined as the border around an HTML element. So every element has a border, right? So let's target the border of our P tag, our first P element, or all our P elements, right? Because we want to affect all of them. So to add a border, uh, we just put in there the border property, and then let's make it a 2 pixel thickness, solid. It's gonna be a solid line, and let's say blue color, right? So if I refresh this, it's gonna have the blue around it, so that's the border, right? And then let's look at another type called the padding. Padding is just the space between the text and the border. So this blue border and the text, the space between it is called your padding. So let's add some padding to this. Want to pad it up a little bit. So padding, and I'm gonna say padded by say 20 pixels, right? And if I refresh this, you're gonna see that the space has increased between the text and then the border, right? And then we are gonna have the margin. Let's do a margin. The margin is the space outside of the border, right? So this is this blue border. The space outside of it, you want some space between the border and outside elements, right? So I'm gonna put in here margin, and I'm gonna say 30 pixels. And when I refresh this, you're gonna see that outside the border, you need the space between the elements and the outside is now 30 pixels, right? So you can see that it kind of shrunk down a little bit, right? So that is your margin. And one more thing we want to discuss before we end this lesson, and which we already talked about, is you can also have, and let me go back to my HTML, you can also have links to an external CSS, right? So instead of having it locally, you can have it somewhere else on the site, right? So you can have it as uh, if there's an external HTTP link that you already have that has the styles there, you can put it in there. You can just put the link in here, right? Or if it's on a separate uh, directory, and let's say I created a CSS folder in my directory. So let me say CSS, right? And in this CSS folder, let's see, let me copy this and paste it in here. So I have a styles, and maybe let me name it differently, right? Rename this to be styles 2.css, right? So I have a styles 2.css in a CSS folder, and it's the same, completely the same thing. But let's say I want to reference that instead. So I need to navigate to that. So in my href, all I need to do is that from the current folder, navigate to CSS and then styles2.css. And if I refresh this, it should stay the same because it's the exact same style, right? So you can have a relative path in there. So thanks for watching this chapter, or this lesson, sorry. We are going to use this basic knowledge in lessons down the line. So that's why I wanted to have a brief, or just kind of a little bit of an explanation of what CSS is and how we use it and how we can um, reference this either from an inline, external, uh, or internal style or CSS style. So thank you. See you in the next lesson.